And I heard his name mentioned with high recommendations as a speaker, something like, I don't know, 8 years ago, something like that. And if you ever get a chance to bring somebody, bring Arunas, So I kept thinking, well, I should do that. And then about a year and a half ago, a good friend of mine, a member of the club, Monica Starr, asked, could you get Arunas and get him to come and do a talk, And she even suggested talk things. So I reached out and I still wasn't getting anywhere. So then I went to David McLeish. So David got me through to Arunas, and we got this set up, and we have Arunas here to present tonight. But unfortunately, Monica, I was going to invite her to do the thank you or something. She's away on a trip someplace, so she's not going to get it. But anyway, and we also have a guest recorder here tonight, Roger Klein from, and he's not related to Bill Klein. I checked, but he's from the Collingwood area, and he's recording this event, and he's connected with the On the Bay magazine. There's some magazine samples here, and Willie's been writing wonderful writing articles in that as well. So we've got this embrace from across the bay. So it's nice to be having everybody here together tonight. So with Arunas Liskaukas, he's basically responsible for, the shore to shore, like Lake Huron, shore to shore. So I wore my shore to shore shirt tonight, but this shore to shore is only from one side of the peninsula to the other, so it's just on land. But anyway, that's what it's for. And he's gonna and I learned that my good friend, cycling and skiing, Ed de la Plante, writer, triathlete, that they're paddling buddies. So I reached out to Ed. I know he lives in Ottawa, but he said, I'm leaving for Finland in an hour. I'll be skiing, so maybe you can catch it on Zoom, on the recording later. So anyway, that's what's going on. And he's doing all kinds of masters events over there. And and also I checked with Jim Hasty, and Jim Arunas has been upstaged by Jim's granddaughter. It's her birthday party today. So otherwise Jim would be here for this too. And I learned about Arunas a few weeks ago from a friend of mine that plays in the city band, Dave Skelton. And there was this connection with, he's this great basketball player, he's famous, and so anyway, he's going to talk about estimating the health and assessing the health of the lakes and the fish communities. And I'm really looking forward to this because I've been waiting to hear your presentations for a long time. So thanks very much. Okay.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. Can you all hear me at the back? Hands? Okay, good. It could be higher. How's that? A little bit better? Okay. I'll try to direct my voice into the mic. So I just wanted to say how honored I am and humbled to be asked to talk with you this evening about Lake Huron, a lake that I've been studying for over 30 years. And I got invited back. I believe I was here 12 years ago. Yeah, and I can't say that I was a lot younger back then, but I was kind of past the midway part of my career. And now I'm looking at the light of retirement. And this is going to be a nice way to do a speaking circuit and talking to the field naturalists of Owen Sound. So I'm going to share with you some insights about Lake Huron. They're going to be snippets. It's not going to be comprehensive because I would have to be allotted possibly half the day to really tell you about all the stories related to Lake Huron. But as I said, I've been studying it for over 30 years, and there's still a lot to know. So without any further ado, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through Lake Huron, giving you some highlights into what's happening on this particular lake. My first slide is just an acknowledgement of all the agencies and entities that have provided data for this presentation. And we're going to go on to one of my mood shots. Can anybody guess where that is? It's on Georgian Bay. It's the French River Delta. And I've had the privilege to work in a lot of locations in the Bay, the North Channel, and the main basin. And one of my favorite spots is the French River Delta. We are so blessed and privileged to live beside this lake we call Lake Huron. It's beautiful, but it's also experiencing some distressing changes. And I'd like to provide you with some insights and highlights into some of these changes that are occurring on the lake. So I thought I'd just give you an overview of my presentation, some of the major themes that I'm going to try to cover. One is that there are distinct basin and regional differences in fish communities. It's always difficult when I get approached by people about the lake and they ask me, so how are the fish doing? It's a very difficult question to answer because the lake is so large, so diverse, and so dynamic. So I'm going to try to give you some context into how fish communities are doing. Sea lamprey are still a major influence on offshore fish communities. Intense lower food web disruption, especially in the offshore waters, has occurred over the last 20 years. The pelagic prey fish collapse and persistent low abundance. I'll elaborate on that in a few slides. The lake whitefish populations have declined over the past 20 years, but the magnitude of this decline varies across the lake. And I'll elaborate on that as well. Lake trout recovery and recruitment has occurred primarily in the main basin and Parry Sound. There has been an incredible walleye resurgence in Saginaw Bay, but that lags in most of Georgian Bay and the North Channel. And in general, nearshore and midshore fish communities still maintain balance and diversity. So you'll see that there's quite a distinct difference to what's happening in the offshore deep waters versus the nearshore shallower waters. So I probably should have had a warning. I hope this slide doesn't alarm you too much. Most of you can recognize what this fish is. Some people like to refer to it as the vampire of the Great Lakes, a very apt name. So it's kind of incredible to realize that we're approaching 100 years since this species of fish made its way up the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Welland Canal, and the Upper Great Lakes, where it wreaked havoc and destruction to the native fish community. I could probably spend half a day talking to you about this species of fish, but I won't. So I'm going to have to make it very succinct. So adult sea lamprey abundance reached a 30-year low quite recently in about 2017. That graph just shows the abundance of adult lamprey. And you could see that we reached the target levels in 2017. And then you could see that there's been a bit of an increase. That's what I like to refer to as the COVID blip. Unfortunately, control measures that are in place to control sea lamprey had to be reduced during COVID because the crews could not do their control efforts like they normally would. So we actually had quite a response from sea lamprey abundance. It increased. So it just goes to show you that you have to keep the pedal to the metal, so to speak, to keep this parasitic fish in numbers that are under control. You can't see very well, but on the right-hand side of that graph, the target number for adult abundance of lamprey is about 100,000 adult lamprey. Each lamprey consumes about 20 kilograms of fish during its life cycle. That's 2 million kilograms of fish that are killed annually by sea lamprey, even with this multi-million-dollar control program that's in place. So sea lamprey are still a major player in terms of structuring the fish community. We've had to alter the landscape to control this species of fish. That picture at the bottom right is the Nicholston Dam on the Nottawasaga River. It's one of the many control structures that are necessary to prevent adult sea lamprey from ascending river habitats where they spawn. And in many of these areas, we have to help fish overcome that barrier. Unfortunately, most of the fishways are built for jumping fish. So the introduced salmon, rainbow trout, fish that have that strength to jump over little rapids and changes in elevation, they are able to use these fishways that are present with these barriers. However, most of our native fish, the suckers, the catfish, the pike, a lot of other species, they can't really use these fishways very effectively. So in essence, we blocked a lot of the traditional spawning habitat for native species in order to control sea lamprey. Just wanted to give you a sense of how daunting the sea lamprey control program, some of the obstacles it has to face. The map on the right just shows all the streams and tributaries that drain into Lake Huron. There's over 1,700. Each of them have the capacity to provide spawning habitat for sea lamprey. There's about 154 streams annually that are surveyed to determine whether they have sea lamprey larval components of the life cycle in them. And you just can't cover all these streams in a given year. So there's a rotation cycle, and it's just a very hard task to control this species. This next map shows some of the barriers that are in place to prevent sea lamprey from migrating upstream. Some of the larger tributaries that drain into Lake Huron, indicated in the yellow. And those red dots are barriers to tributaries. They're mill dams, hydro dams, all kinds of other barriers for fish. But basically, a lot of the tributaries that drain into Lake Huron are now blocked to fish access. And some of you may or may not be aware, but there's quite a movement in recent decades to remove old dams from river systems to allow fish to utilize traditional spawning habitats. A lot of that activity is occurring on the west coast and the east coast of North America. It would be nice to do the same in the Great Lakes. However, you remove a barrier, you also open access for sea lamprey, and that increases the cost of control. So we face a dilemma on the Great Lakes in that any barriers that we have, you can't just remove them without implications on sea lamprey abundance. So we're in a bit of a conundrum. So that's the very truncated sea lamprey story. I'm going to talk about the second wave of invasive species that entered into Lake Huron. The sea lamprey represented a first wave of invasives. So the sea lamprey, alewives, and rainbow smelt were part of that invasion. And that was back in the 1930s, 1940s. Subsequently, we've experienced in more recent years a second wave of invasive species. And these are evidenced by the Dreissenid mussels, otherwise known as zebra and coaga mussels, the round goby, spiny water flea, just to name a few. These species in particular have major impacts on fish communities. I'm going to elaborate on the Dreissenid mussels and round goby, but I just wanted to depict this as the second wave of invasive species. And that's going to be a theme that I talk about, is the effect that invasive species have on the Great Lakes and their fish communities. So the Dreissenid mussels, many of you probably know about the zebra mussel. You know, it was a big thing back in the 90s. It's been replaced by a close relative, the coaga mussel. Coaga mussel is now occupying most of the bottom of the lake in Lake Huron. You can see that graph on the left shows the densities of coaga mussels. On the right is the densities of Diparia, which is a native species of benthic amphipod. And it at one time was a major source of food for fish. High in fat content, found in abundance throughout the bottom of the lake. It's virtually disappeared in many parts of the lake, and it's been replaced by this coaga mussel. The coaga mussel does not have as many nutrients as the Diparia. As well, it's also filter feeding the water column. It's removing a lot of the nutrients in the water column that used to be used in the lower food web that supported fish communities. So the coaga mussels have replaced a Diparia, which was an important food item in the lake. And that's had major implications on what we see currently in the lake. If we look at prey fish, the small silvery fish in the offshore waters that provide a food source for most of our predatory species, they have declined about 80%. And that decline has been major since about 2004. And like I said, I was here 12 years ago. So maybe some of you don't remember that storyline. But in 2004, we had a dramatic decline in species like alewives. They collapsed. They collapsed because coaga mussels were expanding their distribution. There were a lot of predators in the lake, a lot of stock salmon, rainbow trout, and lake trout. So there's a lot of predator demand on prey fish. And we had a relatively cold winter in 2003. So it was a perfect storm. And in 2004, most of the alewives disappeared. And it was because of that combination of factors. And they have not recovered since. And I did mention that alewives are part of that first wave of invasive species. They're not native to the Great Lakes. They're on the Atlantic seaboard. They made their way up through the St. Lawrence Seaway and Welland Canal. Through the 60s and into the early 2000s, those alewives and smelt supported a very popular recreational fishery for Chinook salmon and rainbow trout. There's been quite a dramatic change over the last 2 decades, and it's had a major impact on the abundance of Chinook, rainbow, and lake trout as well. So this alewife collapsed in about 2004, and it hasn't recovered since. And it's found in pockets still, but nowhere near the abundance that it was back in the 90s and early 2000s. Rainbow smelt, also a non-native prey fish, and its abundance has declined substantially as well. Still found in pockets, particularly the North Channel and southern main basin of Lake Huron, but its overall abundance is much lower than it was historically. The bloater. This is another species of fish that I could talk hours on, but I won't. So the bloater is a native prey fish. It's the lone representative of what once was a very diverse deep water cisco species flock. So there were different types of cisco that occupied the deep offshore waters of the lake. And most of those species are gone. That's another theme that I hope I can convey to you, is that the offshore waters of Lake Huron currently are much less productive than they were historically. We're seeing a fraction of the fish biomass that used to be in those offshore waters. The bloater still remains. It's a native prey fish. It's found through parts of the main basin and into the North Channel and Georgian Bay. It's surviving, it's reproducing, but its growth rate is a lot lower than it was historically. It used to be an important commercial fish for commercial fishers, but now it just doesn't get to a large enough size to make it worthwhile. I'm going to mention another prey fish, the cisco, also referred to as the lake herring. It's found in the nearshore waters, relatively shallower waters. It historically was a very important fish as a prey fish and as a commercially sought fish. In Saginaw Bay, it supported harvests of over 9 million pounds per year. So it was a major contributor to the commercial fishery. It just about disappeared by the late 1950s. Saginaw Bay was affected by nutrient enrichment, poor water quality. A lot of the Saginaw Bay and Saginaw River tributaries were deforested. There was a lot of nutrients entering into Saginaw Bay, and the water quality was compromised to the point where this very abundant Cisco species basically collapsed, wasn't reproducing, and it was overharvested by the commercial fisheries of the day. So I'm going to be making connections between our native species and some of the invasive species and trying to help you realize how important those linkages are. So currently, Cisco are restricted to certain areas of the lake. They're still found in relative abundance in the St. Mary's River and Lake Chinook Islands area of the Michigan waters of Lake Huron. They're found in the North Channel in pockets in parts of Georgian Bay and the southern Main Basin. But there's a huge part of the Main Basin where Cisco are absent. And I mentioned alewife and their collapse. Well, they're part of this linkage. Because alewife collapsed, it provided an opportunity to try to reestablish a native species of prey fish. Reestablishing prey fish is a very difficult thing. We've had some success with establishing predator species, but prey fish is another story. So with the demise of alewife, I should mention that alewife are a very effective predator on larval stages of fish, including Cisco. When alewife were very abundant, they ate all the baby Cisco. So that's why they weren't around. So now with the alewife disappearing from much of the lake, there's an opportunity to try to reestablish the Cisco species. And in Michigan, they've started stocking Cisco into Saginaw Bay. They've stocked over 6 million fish over the last 4 or 5 years. And in the most recent surveys, they've recovered about 70 of those. So it doesn't seem like a lot, like 6 million fish. It just shows you how hard it is to restore fish populations in the Great Lakes. But they're getting adults returning. They're getting some evidence of natural reproduction. So this is a work in progress. Hopefully over the next few years, we'll reestablish Cisco into Saginaw Bay, which will be a major accomplishment. I'm kind of bouncing around a bit with these invasive species, native species, but they all kind of weave together into a complex story. So the round goby, part of the second wave of invasive species, they're very difficult to assess with traditional fish capture techniques because they're very cryptic. They like to hide in rocks, and they actually occupy deep parts of the lake. So they're very hard to assess. Well, this is where new technology comes into play with the Goby bot. It's probably out there right now doing some transect somewhere in the lake. So it's an underwater autonomous vehicle, and you can program a path that it'll follow in the lake. And it has high resolution cameras where it takes pictures of the bottom. And when it takes pictures of the bottom, it can translate what looks like something that's featureless into actual fish. So you can see at the bottom right, there's a high-res image at the top, and then there are computer algorithms that are able to convert that picture into actual individual specimens around goby. So you can see that bottom picture there. There's a lot of goby just in that one frame. So we're able to get a better estimate of the total population around goby in Lake Huron. And I guess I'm not going to be letting out any secrets. There are a lot of goby in the lake. And I'm just going to feature a particular location where we've done some more in-depth studies of round goby. And it just happens to be at our doorstep right here in Owen Sound Bay. We did a round goby survey in 2021. We used an electrofishing device that we lower to the bottom of the lake. We put current through this device and it temporarily stuns the fish. And we have a high resolution camera mounted on this frame. So it's able to take a high resolution picture of the bottom. And we're able to translate that into goby abundance. And that map on the right shows you the transects that we sampled. And this is what we found. And that graph may not mean much to you. unless I explain it. But that gray shaded block is the cobble and gravel areas of the bottom. So goby are very abundant where there is cobble and gravel, and they're abundant in very deep parts of the lake. So they're most abundant at about 5 to 15 meters. So about 20 feet to about 60 feet. But they're also present in up to 100 meters of depth. So we still find them at 300 meters or 300 feet. And so they occupy a lot of the bottom of the lake. And when we did some calculations, we calculated that during our daylight surveys, there was about 118 million goby just in Owen Sound Bay. That translates into about 144 tons of fish. And in the night, they're even more abundant because they come out of the cracks, out of the boulders, about 144 million or 237 tons around goby. They are very prominent, and they've only become prominent over the last 2 decades. So they are restructuring the fish community. A lot of predators are now feeding on round goby. Talking about lake trout, our native keystone predator that was decimated by sea lamprey and basically disappeared from the lake by the 1940s. We've been trying to restock it for over 60 years with limited success until recently. And some of you may be asking, why are they now naturally reproducing? Because the alewives are gone. The alewives, they've moved on to feeding on smelt and some of the bloaters and round goby. And some of you may be wondering, like, okay, so why is alewife so bad? Alewife for lake trout is junk food. It literally is junk food. When they have a diet rich in alewives, the alewives have this enzyme called thymidase. When you have a diet rich in thymidase, it breaks down vitamin B, and the eggs are not as fertile as they are without the effects of thymidase. So when they're eating alewives, they rarely reproduce. So the alewives disappeared. Now they're eating other fish, and they're starting to reproduce. So in the main basin in particular, we've seen natural reproduction of lake trout since about 2004, 2005. Really the first signs of substantial natural reproduction in over 60 years. So that's good news story. And again, linked to these invasive species. Their growth rate has declined, however, because overall, the amount of food that's available in the deep offshore waters has declined. I just wanted to briefly highlight another success story because it's not all doom and gloom. For those of you who know Perry Sound, there's a beautiful lake trout population there. It's been successfully rehabilitated. One of the few success stories for lake trout outside of Lake Superior. Lake Superior has a lot of natural reproduction of lake trout. Outside of that lake, there's very few positive signs. Perry Sound is one of them. Lots of young fish, and we've also discovered fish over 20 years of age. So they're surviving, they're reproducing. We don't have to stock there anymore. We haven't stocked for now 20 years, and all the fish are wild. So it's one of those success stories, but it took a lot of effort, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of restrictions on harvest. I'm going to talk about lake whitefish. Unfortunately, this is a species that has been having the hardest time with the changes in the lake. It's been important to the commercial fishery. It is the staple for the commercial fishery and has been for over 100 years. It's a critical species for indigenous communities, for food security, culture, and economics. And we've seen incredible declines in recruitment since about the 1990s. This is commercial harvest of lake whitefish in Lake Huron since the 1980s. And you can see that there's been a dramatic decline since the late 1990s, early 2000s. In southern Georgian Bay, where we monitor fish communities with a survey netting, we have not seen any substantial natural reproduction of lake whitefish for almost 20 years. So what's happening with whitefish? We're trying to figure out what part of their life history is experiencing impediments to survival. The adult, the egg, the larvae, the juveniles. We're getting some insights into that, and we're doing some spring trawling surveys for the larval whitefish. We're finding that whitefish are still going to the spawning grounds, reproducing. The eggs are hatching. This is some work that's being done in the fishing islands on the west side of the peninsula. They're hatching, and we're comparing the hatching in more recent years to some studies that were done in the late 70s and early 80s when whitefish populations were expanding. We're seeing that they're hatching, but not nearly as many as they were historically, and their growth rate is much lower than it was historically. The theory is that there's just not enough food. The larvae hatch, there's not a lot of plankton in the water. Why is there not a lot of plankton in the water? Because the coaga mussels are sucking out all the nutrients in the water column. So this is what's happening. The lake whitefish don't seem to be able to get enough feed in their early life history stages. This concern about whitefish has resulted in an incredible partnership between the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, Parks Canada, and Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. The initiative is called Together with Googie Egg, Together with Fish, and it's an incredible collaboration where we're looking at two-eyed seeing, acknowledging the importance of traditional ecological knowledge as well as Western science, and using both ways of seeing to try to understand what's happening to lake whitefish. One of the ways that that's being done is implanting adult lake whitefish with acoustic tags. And those acoustic tags can be monitored with receivers that are placed on the bottom of the lake. So when you tag a lake whitefish, these receivers that are distributed throughout the lake will monitor the movements of these fish. So we want to see how their movements have changed with the advent of coaga mussels, low nutrients in the water column, to see whether we can identify the impediments to their survival. And I'm just going through this very quickly because I just don't have time to elucidate everything. But this is just a depiction of all the acoustic receivers currently in the lake. So the lake is wired for sound. This is an incredibly ambitious undertaking, and we're in the early stages of it, and we're tagging lake whitefish, lake trout, lake sturgeon, and walleye, and trying to determine how these fish have changed their movement patterns throughout the lake. So in the next few years, we hope to have some concrete results and get a better sense of how the lake has changed. So that's a pretty amazing development. Before I leave lake whitefish, I just want to leave you with a sense of how profound the changes in the lake have been over the last 20 years. This is a graph showing the diet of lake whitefish in different parts of the lake: the North Channel, Georgian Bay, Northern Main Basin, Central Main Basin, and Southern Main Basin. It's hard to decipher this graph, but I'll try to do my best. So the blue is Dreissena, the zebra mussels, the coaga mussels. So whitefish are feeding on these mussels, but I mentioned that their nutrient level is very low. So they're not growing as well, they're not as reproductively fit, but they are eating these mussels, but it's not benefiting them very much. Another thing, surprising thing that they're eating is round goby, which is that brownish color. So in certain parts of the main basin in particular, whitefish are now consuming young of the year goby because it's the most abundant food source that's out there. So we've changed the lake dramatically. And when you look at the major food items for lake whitefish in recent years, round goby, Dreissenid mussels, Bithotrephes, that spiny water flea, rainbow smelt, the non-native prey fish, and mollusks. Mollusks are the only native organism that whitefish are currently eating. So whitefish are eating a diet that's totally different from what they ate historically. And the implications of that are pretty substantial. So this is the part of my story that I'm supposed to do a time check. John, where are you? How far am I into the talk? Oh, well, I've got to watch here. I've got 10 to 8. I've got you half an hour. Wonderful. Because I didn't want to get the shallow waters too short shrift of an introduction. So I'm going to transition from the deep offshore waters to the shallower waters. So I'm changing gears here. I hope you can stick with me. Is everybody still okay? Okay, good. So Lake Huron is special in a lot of ways. One of them is because it's so diverse. The nearshore areas cover a large extent of geology and bathymetry and structure. And these are just some of the different types of shoreline features that you typically see in Lake Huron. And it's the most diverse lake of all the Great Lakes. You know, the main basin with the deeper waters, the sand spits and the beach areas. You got the Canadian Shield with the river systems. You got all these coastal wetlands, very diverse shoreline. And that basically translates into very diverse fish communities. So I mentioned that question that I get asked often. So how are the fish doing in Lake Huron? Well, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to answer is because depending on where you are, the fish community is different. So I'm just going to give you a very high level view of what the fish community looks like in the nearshore areas. I'm going to focus initially on some surveys that monitor the small fish, so using small capture gear. And so this is giving us a general picture of the small fish in the nearshore areas. The main basin, again, I'll explain these pie charts. The red or brownish color is minnows. So in the main basin, it's dominated by minnow species, emerald shiners, the different shiner species. And certain parts or certain areas of the lake, like Godrich, where the Maitland River discharges, there's a lot of bass, a lot of young of the year bass. So it's quite variable. You know, even one site-specific area can have a very different fish community than the adjacent one. You see up in the South Bay area in Manitoulin that there's minnows, there's a bit of perch, and there's also some gobies, round gobies. So in general, it's still dominated by native fish species. If we go to the North Channel, again, the minnows are quite prominent. Yellow perch are quite prominent. And then you've got some catfish and bass that are also prominent, but very distinct from the main basin. And then you go to Georgian Bay, and there you've got minnows, you got bass, and if you go to Owen Sound, you got gobies. Gobies are very prominent in Owen Sound. Some of you may ask, like, why are they so prominent in Owen Sound? Shipping. They probably were established initially in Owen Sound because of ballast discharge in the local area. So they've had a longer time to adapt and evolve to this area than in other locations. But goby are everywhere, but they are very prominent in Owen Sound. So very different small fish species depending on where you are. So I'm going to shift to some of the more charismatic, larger fish in the near shore. Walleye in particular. It's very popular, high demand because of its eating qualities. Like, if anybody's had walleye, you know what I'm talking about. It's very high in demand. And I'm going to go and tell you about a tale of two sides of the lake. And this might be surprising to some of you, but I'll try to explain. So walleye in Saginaw Bay in the last decade or so have experienced an incredible resurgence in abundance. And this graph on the top right just shows the abundance of young of the year walleye as indicated by catch rates and trawling efforts. And those green bars are pretty consistent. And that consistency is consecutive strong year classes being produced, to the point where they've stopped stocking walleye in Saginaw Bay since 2006. So these are all naturally produced walleye currently. And they're estimating an adult abundance of walleye of over 10 million fish in Saginaw Bay. 10 million fish. That's a lot of walleye. So why are they doing so well in Saginaw Bay? Alewife collapse. The alewives fed on larval stages of walleye. So the walleye were reproducing in a pretty dirty river. The Saginaw River is not the prettiest areas in the watershed. However, there's enough productivity there, enough reproductive habitat for walleye that they were reproducing. Initially, all their recruitment was being consumed by alewives. When alewives basically disappeared in the early 2000s, all of a sudden, those young larval walleye were able to survive. And now you've got an incredible walleye fishery that's established itself in Saginaw Bay. In our waters, unfortunately, we have not seen the same effect of the decline in alewife, primarily because most of our populations are associated with smaller tributary systems draining off the Canadian Shield. So we don't have that productivity. Walleye thrive in nutrient-rich waters, kind of off-color waters. And we have historically produced large walleye in Georgian Bay and the North Channel. It just takes them a long time to reach that size, like 10 to 15 years. And unfortunately, walleye are so popular that recreational fishers, commercial fishers, indigenous communities, they all want walleye. And we just don't have the resiliency in those populations to accommodate that demand. So most of the surveys that we've done on walleye show that the abundance of walleye is quite low throughout Georgian Bay and the North Channel. So we've been trying to embark on this walleye management plan. It's a challenge because we've got many populations. I just wanted to highlight Saginaw Bay in the Michigan waters there, that indentation, Saginaw Bay. It's basically one localized population of walleye, whereas we've got over 24 associated with different tributary systems draining into Georgian Bay and the North Channel. And a lot of these tributary systems have been altered as a result of mining, forestry, all kinds of other activities, road building. Walleye home to very specific spawning locations, usually rapids, river rapids. And a lot of those habitats have been damaged or altered throughout eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel. So a lot of the reproductive habitat for walleye has been damaged over the years. One of the things that we're trying to do is try to add resiliency to spawning habitat. Can anybody guess where that is? Not the French, but good guess. Not the Spanish. Good guesses. That's another good guess. This is actually the Moon River. Most of you know the Moon River? Moon River. The Maroon River is just south of Parry Sound. It's part of the Muskoka River drainage. So you've got the Moon River and the Musquash as two major outlets of the Muskoka River. And what you see there are cobble gravel features that were constructed about a decade ago. This is probably one of the major habitat rehabilitation efforts that we've undertaken in eastern Georgian Bay. And this was done after we had those low lake level years. When we had low lake levels from 1999 to 2014, we realized that some of the traditional spawning habitat for walleye was inaccessible to them because the lake levels were so low that they would have to jump over rock lips, which were 2 or 3 feet high. when we had the very low lake levels. So we built these features further downstream to try to expand and enhance reproductive habitat for walleye. And we're just going back this year to determine whether we've seen an increase in the abundance of walleye as a result of this habitat rehabilitation. Have you heard the saying, build it and they will come? So even though we were focused on walleye, we are now seeing lake sturgeon utilizing these artificial habitats. And we're hoping that they are successfully reproducing, because in a lot of the tributary systems in Georgian Bay and the North Channel, lake sturgeon were basically extirpated. They're starting to make a slow comeback. They're prominent in the Mississauga River in the North Channel, the Spanish, the French River, and the Nottawasaga River. Nottawasaga River is a major hotbed for sturgeon. Can any of you guess where the highest density and number of lake sturgeon spawning occurs in Lake Huron? St. Clair, the St. Clair River, the Blue Water Bridge. I passed over it just a few weeks ago. Has anybody gone over the Blue Water Bridge? Look down. That is a major spawning area for lake sturgeon. Kind of incredible because it's like 30 to 40 feet deep, strong current, and they're down at the bottom spawning in that area, which is pretty amazing. So, I always like to throw in a few impact slides just to bring you into my world. I've done a lot of studies on muskellunge in Georgian Bay and the North Channel, and it's just an amazing fish. And we've been studying muskellunge for about 20 years. We've had a very productive relationship with McMaster University, who have been studying coastal wetlands. And muskie need coastal wetlands to be able to reproduce. So you can see the distribution of muskie throughout eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel. Like, they're not everywhere. They're a very special component of the fish biodiversity in the lake. And they're found through a number of locations throughout the lake. And they're found because we have healthy coastal wetlands. A lot of those wetlands are in eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel. A lot of the other lakes, the lower lakes, a lot of their wetlands have been destroyed or filled in. We still have a lot of intact wetlands. However, there's a high demand for shoreline property. And the first thing that people want to do when they buy shoreline property, clean it up. And if there's vegetation like that, we got to get rid of that vegetation. Well, that has direct impacts on fish like muskellunge. They need those coastal wetlands. We still have them, but we can't neglect them because they can be lost. And we have lost some, particularly in Severn Sound and that southern Georgian Bay area. So I'm just going to finish up with a few slides that hopefully give you a sense of how difficult it is to have a pat answer for how nearshore fish communities are doing. I'm just going to focus on one location in eastern Georgian Bay. Do any of you have a familiarity with Shawanaga, Point of Barrel? Yeah, there's someone in the back. Beautiful area, kind of typical of the 30,000 Islands area. We've done some fish community surveys there. This is just an example of netting locations using different survey types. So you look at that and you say, wow, you have to pretty well know that fish community after sampling all those locations, don't you? Well, not really, because, well, first of all, those dots are kind of big. When you're out there on the water, you realize you're just covering a very small area. But we get a general sense of the fish community. And in this part of eastern Georgian Bay, we have a relatively healthy fish community dominated by native species. And I've always had a hard time trying to find a simple way of conveying what that fish community looks like. I've had graphs, pie graphs, bar graphs, trend lines, and all that kind of stuff. But, I think pictures tell a better story. So this is kind of, what's the word I want to use? It's not about me. It's about the smallmouth bass. Okay. So smallmouth bass are one of the species, one of the native species that's benefiting from the changes in the environment. So global warming, it's what you call a cool warm water species. It's benefiting from warmer temperatures. It's eating goby. It's getting bigger than it normally would. It's reproducing a lot more effectively because of its diet around goby, and it's getting a lot larger. And it's expanding its range, and it's doing quite well in the current situation in Georgian Bay and other parts of the lake. So I'm going to focus on the big five. The five species of fish that comprise over 80% of number caught and biomass. So most of you will know these fish. Bass, it's the age of bass. Bass are the most dominant predator in the nearshore. Yellow perch are still found in the nearshore, but we don't see them growing very large. We don't have jumbo perch like they do in Lake Simcoe and Lake Erie and other places, but they're still around. Rock bass, the lowly rock bass, it's actually going through a population recovery with the diminishment of cormorants. Now, I got to be careful when I mention cormorants here, because on one side, it's an indication that the environment and contaminant levels have declined, improving reproductive conditions for cormorants. But they're a very effective predator. They mostly fed on alewife when alewife were abundant. With the collapse of alewife, we've seen a dramatic decline in cormorant abundance in Lake Huron. A lot of those cormorants that used to nest in those offshore islands are now going to inland lakes. And you're seeing them in areas that you typically wouldn't. I've seen them in my beloved Algonquin Park. But that's another story. I won't get into that. But rock bass are recovering because there's a lot less predation on them. Walleye, one of the few locations in eastern Georgian Bay where walleye are still prominent in the Shawanaga River area. And the brown bullhead. In some locations, brown bullhead are very abundant. And they're benefiting from less alteration to the benthos in nearshore areas. So they're a bottom feeder. They use their barbels to find stuff on the bottom. And they're just doing quite well, actually. So if we look at weight of fish, we've got a little bit of a difference here. Smallmouth are still the most abundant in terms of biomass. Northern pike, larger bodied fish. It's still prominent in eastern Georgian Bay. It wasn't doing very well with those low lake levels. It's responding positively to increases in lake levels. But again, it needs those coastal wetlands to reproduce effectively. Walleye are larger bodied fish, still prominent. Does anybody know about red horse suckers? What a wonderful sucker species. They are amazing. And they run up a lot of the tributary systems that drain into eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel. But we know next to nothing about them. There are some net lifts that I've been witness to where we are bringing up 10, 15, 20-pound red horse sucker, and they are strong fish. But it's amazing that they're doing quite well in many locations because they're not being harvested, right? It's kind of a species that is doing its business. And as long as the river systems that they spawn in are healthy, they'll do well. And the white sucker, like, come on. Why don't people appreciate the white sucker? It's still quite abundant, still an important part of the nearshore fish community. So, as the river flows, so does my knowledge to you. At least I hope. Did I stay under an hour? Oh, wonderful. So maybe we have time for questions. Did you want to facilitate this, or because I don't want to show any bias towards who I pick? Okay.
pair. Grim?
Do you have anything you can share with us about the anticipated environmental changes off Vale Point if and when they go ahead with that hydro development?
Can you give the question into the?
Yes, you're referring to the hydro generating proposal at the
Water of the lake,
Department of National Defense. Yes,
sure,
yes.
that's going to affect the fish habitat, and if so, in which way?
Well, I don't know if I can directly answer your question, but I can do it peripherally as a biologist. Fish communities evolve over time, and they evolve slowly, and they adapt to changes over time. When you have a dynamic environment, like possibly will be associated with this facility, you can surmise whether fish communities can adapt to those dramatic changes in a short period of time. It's something that, most biological communities have not experienced. So I can't say definitively one way or the other, but
Maybe we'll go this gentleman and then Gord.
Thank you. Great presentation. I'd love to know your level of concern around potential future invasive species like perhaps the Asian carp. If not that, what else is potentially kind of out there on the wings that's a potential risk to the ecosystem going forward?
great question.
So it's the online
So-
people, they can't hear.
Yes. So what anticipated introductions of species like, we refer to them as invasive carp now. So are there things in the future that could affect fish communities in the Great Lakes and Lake Huron in particular? Excellent question. You see how dramatic the changes have been so far. And some of them are unanticipated, like unpredictable. And, one of the themes of my talk is that it's so hard to predict where future fish communities, what they will look like because of all these changes. Invasive carp can have a dramatic impact on the Great Lakes fish communities. That's why the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and other agencies are doing a lot to try to put barriers in place to prevent those invasive carp, which are right at the doorstep of the Great Lakes. They're in the Chicago Sanitary Canal, and that leads directly to the Great Lakes. I don't know if I'm the harbinger of bad news, but already one of those species of carp, the grass carp, has reproduced successfully and has established populations in Lake Erie. So that the Sandusky River and Maumee River currently have spawning populations of grass carp. And that's a big concern because grass carp feed on aquatic macrophytes. Aquatic macrophytes comprise coastal wetlands. If you've got a lot of grass carp, they're going to feed on those wetlands and compromise them. In fact, they can eradicate coastal wetlands. So there's a lot of effort now at monitoring, trying to keep that population low. But once they enter an ecosystem, it's so hard to control their numbers. So only time will tell. They kind of have specific long reaches of reproduce, and those rivers aren't necessarily very abundant throughout the Great Lakes, but there are some, as we already see in Lake Erie. So that's one of the major concerns that we have. There's been a lot of efforts to control ballast water exchange from ocean-going vessels. And so there's been legislation that requires seagoing vessels to discharge the ballast in salt water as opposed to the Great Lakes. So we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of invasive species that are establishing in the Great Lakes. But there's always different pathways for invasives to get into the Great Lakes. Water gardens, water plants, Like if you look at some of the horticulture facilities, some of the water plants that they're selling, they're not native to North America, and they can make their way into the Great Lakes. So that's another example. And there's, viruses and parasites and other things that can also enter the lake. So sometimes we look and wait and watch and hope that we don't get any further introductions that will just be disruptive. Yeah, excellent question.
Maybe Gord over here.
You didn't mention the non-invasive carp. Is it still a non-issue now?
So the question was about the non-invasive carp. So you're referring to the common carp?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a native species, but it's been with us for so long that we just accept it. So the common carp was introduced into the Great Lakes. In a lot of cases, inadvertently, people had them as ornamental fish in ponds that were connected to a waterway that eventually drained into the Great Lakes. So common carp have been around since the late 1800s. I would say that they're not benign, that they're still out there and they still uproot vegetation. I grew up cottaging in Port Severn area, and I could remember going out with my grandfather and netting carp, common carp in the springtime. And they would be in the shallows, in the wetland areas, just mucking things up. Like they would stir the bottom up and they would tear up the vegetation. So they still have a negative impact on fish communities, but it's not as dramatic as some of the other species. They're out there, but they haven't increased to the point where they're, very noticeable.
Maybe we'll go here.
Great. With the mild winter we're having, I've read a couple of reports about the lack of ice cover, particularly Lake Huron, and the decline or reduction of water and plants. Would that have been, and when you compare that with the lack of ice across the Great Lakes, but also ice fishing, right? Sportsmen, there's been no ice fishing, so that's going to have an effect on fish population as well.
So the question was the lack of ice, what impact might that have? Time will tell. The trend has been towards a reduced ice coverage in the Great Lakes. Pretty dramatic this year. I mentioned that, I may not have mentioned that lake trout and lake whitefish and cisco spawn in relatively near shore reefs and shoals. And they look for that coarse cobble and rubble substrate to deposit their eggs. And a lot of those locations are vulnerable to wave action, fall storms. And now we're getting these storms later in the year. We don't have the near shore protected by that ice cover. You get a lot of turbulence. And the implications of that are that a lot of those eggs will be destroyed or silted over. So that's an area of study that is being focused on, but there are some indications that low ice cover means less reproductive output from some of these deep water, cold water species.
Is the perceived warming of the Great Lakes having a big impact on the fish?
What about the warming of the waters in the Great Lakes? So that's another area of study. There's a lot of research groups that are looking at the Great Lakes. Some of the preliminary indications are that Lake Superior is the lake that's warming the most rapidly. And the implications of that are that, Lake Erie or Lake Superior is a deep cold water lake supporting mostly cold water species. So over time, that could have major implications on those cold water fish. Even lakes like Lake Huron, when you really look at it, the deep parts of the lake are in the northern main basin and the western shore of Georgian Bay. And when those start to warm excessively, it's going to have an impact on these cold water species. And it's not,
fish going deeper now?
they're probably trying to do that. And they're trying to follow forage and prey. And it's quite a complex situation. And we don't really know exactly how they are adapting to these changes, but they're coming a lot quicker than we anticipated.
I think there's one more at the back here. Yeah.
You mentioned that the diet of the whitefish has changed. Does that change the quality of the fish, the taste?
So the question is, has the change in diet of lake whitefish affected their quality, their flavor, their taste? That's a good question. I'm not a commercial fisher or indigenous fisher, but some of the stories that I've heard indicate that they're trying to adapt to this new diet, and some of the commercial fishers are seeing that a lot of the stomach lining and the intestinal tract of these lake whitefish are red and raw, and primarily because they're trying to eat these hard-bodied dracenids. So the implication is that they're not growing as good. I don't know whether it's impacted their flavor, but we're in a pretty tough state with lake whitefish. It's very disconcerting and concerning. Whitefish are very culturally important for Indigenous communities, and we're going to have to work together to figure this out. But yeah, that's a serious area of inquiry right now.
Graham?
While we're talking about whitefish, on your plan there, which shows the sounding stations around, there seem to be quite a concentration of them in Nottawasaga Bay. Any particular reason for that?
Part of that is to do this ecological inventory of fish species in the area in which the proposed power generation plant is going to be situated. So there are crews with Saugeen Ojibwe Nation that are looking at the distribution of fish in that location. So they're tagging whitefish, we're tagging lake trout as well, and also some of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation folks are tagging lake sturgeon that are using the Nottawasaga River as a spawning river to see where they go post-spawn. So they may be utilizing that shoreline area that's being proposed for the power plant.
Marcia, last question.
Great presentation. Is there anything being done to control the sea lamprey?
Is there anything being done to control sea lamprey? I may have given that part of the talk short shrift, but annually over $20 million is spent to control sea lamprey. So primarily with a lampricide, so a chemical that specifically targets the early life stages of sea lamprey. So the adults that spawn in these river systems, the eggs, once they hatch, the larvae, or they call them ammocetes, they burrow themselves into sediment areas, so soft bottom areas. And those larval lamprey spend 5 to 8 years in those tributary habitats developing into adult sea lamprey that become parasitic. So when they're in the rivers, they're not parasitic, but once they leave the rivers, they become parasitic. So when they're in the rivers, this chemical targets their metabolic functions, so it asphyxiates them basically. They can't breathe. And it's very specific to the early life stages of sea lamprey. There are some species of fish, like lake sturgeon, that have some sensitivity. So depending on the watershed that's being treated, they try to time the application of this chemical when certain juvenile stages of fish aren't in the river system. So it's been effective. But, people still have concerns about putting chemicals in the water. And there's this one concern that's growing in that a lot of organisms that we try to control with chemicals, over time, they develop a resistance. And you see that with pesticides, with insects that, attack agricultural crops. Over time, they develop resistance to some of these harsh chemicals, right? And you just have to keep putting more and more chemical in, and to the detriment of the ecology of the area. So they're trying to diversify the control measures, not just relying on the chemical. So those barriers are one way of doing it, but it blocks access to a lot of native fish. They're trying to put traps in some of these barrier locations, so they trap the adults before they ascend the rivers. They're also looking at pheromones. So trying to attract sea lamprey to specific watersheds where they have a trap to trap these adults. Because the pheromones, the females release a pheromone that attracts the males. So, and then there's sterilization techniques where they capture at these traps primarily male lamprey. They bring them to the lab, they sterilize them. They're still alive. Then they release them back into that population. They behave normally and they try to spawn with females, but none of the eggs hatch, like they don't get fertilized. So there's a lot of different things that are going on. It just shows you how difficult it is to control an organism once it gets into a novel ecosystem. So this, not really, no. So the sea lamprey, once they get into the open waters, they go deep. And so they're not really within reach of a lot of those warm water predators. Are they good to eat? Are the lamprey good to eat? Well, you're not the first one to ask that question. They've tried, it's actually a delicacy in parts of Europe. And they've tried exporting sea lamprey probably about 20 years ago. And once they did some testing on the lamprey, they found out their contaminant levels are quite high. So they had a lot of chemical contaminants. So once that got out, it wasn't a delicacy anymore. So it's a parasite. It feeds on the bodily fluids of larger fish like lake trout. Lake trout are long-lived. So if you attach yourself to, let's say, a 20-pound lake trout, it's probably been in the lake for 20 to 25 years. It has a high contaminant burden. So the lamprey are concentrating all those contaminants into its own. No, you don't want to eat big fish. No.
Fred, you're on.
No, it's close enough. Call me Ralph. Call me late for dinner. Wow, what a great talk. When I first met this gentleman, he said he grew up in Hamilton, and John and I grew up in Port Credit, Lakeview. And the thing that we shared, and many of you in here probably will have these memories, springtime, smelt runs. In the 1960s and 70s, we'd go down to the shoreline, the river mouths, and get baskets and baskets of smelt. And I understand in Owen Sound, Balmy Beach area was a very popular spot for smelt. Those days are gone. And what you've shared tonight, the changes in that. I can give you a couple little tidbits. I fish a bit. I usually get asked because I don't own a boat, but it's nice to have friends that have big boats. But a couple things. In the 1970s, the Toronto Star introduced the salmon spectacular down there. And during the 1970s, the average fish was 45 to 50 pounds. In the last 5 to 10 years, they're 20 to 25. In Owen Sound, when the salmon spectacular started here in the mid 80s, the winning fish was over 40 pounds. The last 10 years, they've been lucky to get them around 20. So there's an impact just on the local fisheries. I'm very proud to announce, or share with you, we have a student that graduated from Owen Sound, Alex Adair. Alex received the Malcolm Kirk Award from the Conservation Foundation, and he's studying biology in that at University of Guelph. This gentleman's learning spot. And Alex shared with me, he volunteers, and he's been checking gobies for the last 2 summers. And he has some excellent documents, so if you're really fascinated. But he shared with me, he did the research from Meaford to Thornbury. And he said there are millions and millions of gobies. But one thing he shared with me, because he analyzes the fish, and he opens up the fish, especially whitefish and different species, and saying that the gobies are eating the mussels. And that's, we were so petrified of the zebra mussels and that, but at least the gobies are doing something. Now, tonight you've shared a number of things. The sea lamprey, interesting. If you want to see 4 or 2, if you want to see guys skirm when you're out in the boat fishing, bring in a fish with a lamprey on it. The guys go all nuts. So someone has to take that lamprey off the fish. And it's a horrible thing because it's shocking when you've got this 20-pound salmon or whatever lake trout, and there's the lamprey on it, and you've got to remove that lamprey. And you see the guys running in the boat. Most people want to touch it, so you try to get it, and most times we kill it. Now, when I was a youngster and would come up to Southampton, the Jackson brothers used to sell lampreys. They would have a tank, and they were catching lampreys in the mid-60s and at the mouth of the Saugeen, and they sold them there. Now, tonight you've shared so many things. First about the invasive species, and then the fish, and all the different things. And it is scary, but the more we can do the research, the more we'll learn about how we can adapt. So on behalf of the audience here tonight, I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Gordon. How are you?